Happy 150th birthday to Miss Amanda Mayhayley Lancaster. We'd like to share just a few of the interesting stories as told by those who knew her best, her neighbors, her preacher, and even a Hollywood starlet. Mayhayley was born one of 11 children in 1875. She was born with a caul over her eyes, which meant that the embryonic sac had not completely uncovered her as an infant. In those days, they thought that that meant you had an extraordinary life ahead, and indeed, she did. Y'all, hey, come on into my garden now. My name is Willis, and I'm a neighbor now to Miss Mayhayley Lancaster. She lets me do chores around her house, and she pays me a dime for the work, and I surely appreciate that. Times are hard for us dirt farmers, and when we first moved in down the street from Miss Mayhayley, well, she came on down the road real neighborly like and talked to my mama and told my mama she offered her some squash seeds. And she told her they were the best of the best, and that they'd grow the biggest, most delicious yellow squash we'd ever seen. Well, Mama thanked her, of course, for the trouble, but as soon as Miss Mayhayley got out of earshot, Mama told me she didn't know how one seed could be any better than the other, but she sent me right out to plant them, and I pulled the weeds that summer, and I watched them sprout up, and I kept a close eye on the rain. Lo and behold, those seeds grew some of the biggest squash plants I'd ever seen. Then those bright yellow flowers started popping out, and look at all of this squash. We grew so much squash that year, Mama was able to put them up in little jars. She'd add a little sliver of some delicious sweet Vidalia onions. And that Christmas, Mama fixed them up for supper. It was like tasting summer in December. Now, Mama was real happy with them seeds, so she sent me down there to do some chores for Miss Mayhayley, and I'd split wood, feed the chickens, muck the coop, and let me tell you something about mucking a chicken coop for Miss Mayhayley Lancaster. Well, she had a way of hiding her money. Now, she charged people $1 and a dime. I'm not sure if y'all have heard about that yet, but you will. She charged them $1 and a dime to have 20 minutes of having her read your spirits, read your fortune. And she would do that, and she'd pay me a dime for working in her yard all that time. Now, let me tell you something about Miss Mayhayley's money. She didn't trust no bank, so she'd hide those dollars all around here in mason jars full of them, all in the roosting boxes around her yard. I'd muck that coop out regular, but Miss Mayhayley always made it very clear to leave those jars alone, and I always did. But some folks figured out about the stash, and sometimes when she'd be out at the courthouse buying her some property on a tax sale, she'd come back home, found out she'd been robbed. She'd been robbed 22 times. Well, the sheriff out here in Heard County, he got real tired of being called out all the time for that crime. He came out and told her, "You got to put that money in the bank." Well, I think it was against her better judgment, but after being robbed 22 times, she agreed. And the sheriff's men all gathered up the money, and it came up to bags full of money. Well, the sheriff carried her into Franklin and to the bank, and the bank man there, he said that money was too dirty to make a deposit. So she carried them 2 satchels of money across the street to the grocery store, where the clerks agreed to clean the money. Well, after 3 hours of them wiping down that nasty cash, it counted up to be $33,000. Woo-wee! Well, for their efforts, Miss Mayhayley paid them a dime, about the same thing she'd pay me for a full day's of work. She was thrifty, I guess you could say, but you know, folks come from all around here. Hey, did you hear about that woman? Come here all the way from California. Welcome, darlings. Come on in. Is the feature over? Lovely. Come on in, and I'd like to talk to you about coming on over here to Georgia to see a woman I read about in the newspaper. Now, out there in Hollywood, I know about fake people, and I was reading this story about Miss Mayhayley, and I thought, Could this be real? Well, the story goes that Miss Mayhayley had some teenagers come to visit her one evening, and they came on out there, and they came out on a lark just to have Miss Mayhayley read their fortune. And that night she read the fortune of 2 of the girls and 2 of the boys, but there was one girl. She didn't tell her fortune, darling, and one of the boys asked Miss Mayhayley why. Miss Mayhayley said, apparently, as the story goes, well, she doesn't have a fortune. She does not have a future. I read on that evening those teenagers were in a horrific car crash, and of all of the ones in the car, only the girl that Mayhayley refused to read her fortune of died in that crash. The rest survived, as she predicted. Well, I thought about that, and I'd been lost a ring over on my family's property over there in Alabama, so I drove my car with the California tag on over there to see Miss Mayhayley, and was ready to pay my dollar and a dime. And when I pulled up, her sister Sally came running on out and said, "You come on in, we know who you are. You come on in, we've had people come from far and wide, but we believe you've come the furthest." And when I went in, well, Miss Mayhayley, she started stirring that fire. She'd spit a little into the fire, setting off a little blast of smoke. Then she spread some cards out on the table. I reckon she was going to read them too. And I said, "Oh, I forgot to pay you that dollar and a dime." Miss Mayhayley looked at me and she said, "A dollar and a dime, by the Spirit's time." And as she read and as she spit and as she looked at those cards, she started telling me I was missing a ring, which I was. She told me to go back to my family's house in Alabama and go up the servants' steps in the back and go to the 3rd trunk in the attic. Pull back a quilt that was pink and green, and I would find the missing ring. Well, I shot on out of there and went on back to Alabama, and sure enough, I went up that flight of steps. 3rd trunk, under the pink and green quilt, was the ring that I'd been missing. Well, I appreciate y'all stopping on by. I wanted to share with you that about Miss Mayhayley. She was quite the wonderful woman. One of the more famous stories about Mayhayley's forecasting or finding things, finding people and things, has to do with the Chattahoochee River. Now, there was a young man who had left one afternoon and said he was going to go fishing. The water was pretty rough, but he left anyway, and that night he did not return. And his young bride became very concerned about him, and she went to her father-in-law and said, "Hey, he didn't come back from a fishing trip, and I'm worried about him." So the family came looking in boats, and the whole area, folks came looking for him, and no one ever found him. So they went to Mayhayley, and Mayhayley told them to go back to the Chattahoochee River and look around the bend, and they would see him in the distance. He didn't have his jacket on anymore, but he still had his hat. And if they had come 3 days earlier, there's the 3 days again, that they would find him alive, but she did not believe that they would find him alive. And the family did follow her instructions, and they came out and they looked and they found the boy. Just as Mayhayley said, his hair was brushed across his face, and they found his body. And they were very sad that they hadn't asked Mayhayley 3 days before, because she believed they would have found him alive. But that is one of the very famous stories of Mayhayley and the lost fisherman. Good Sunday morning to y'all. My name is Miss Clara Bryan. My husband is the preacher around here, and I wanted to share with you a little bit about Miss Mayhayley. Now, we all went to church out there in Roopville at Caney Head Methodist Church, and that's where we laid Miss Mayhayley to eternal rest. But she was quite the godly woman. I can tell you, she would study hard in church. Now, the funny thing about Miss Mayhayley is she always walked to church. she never would catch a ride. She always walked to church, and her dogs, all those yapping dogs, just would follow her all down the road. It was quite a sight to see. Well, she would come into the church, and them dogs would follow her right on in and get underneath the pew at her feet. Now, nobody said much to her, on account of Miss Mayhayley was one of the biggest tithers that church had ever seen. If the choir needed new robes, Miss Mayhayley would chip in a few extra dollars and a few extra dimes. If the church needed painted, well, we showed up on a Sunday morning, and there'd be some whitewash paint buckets right out in front of the door, and we knew Miss Mayhayley had left them there for us. Now, Miss Mayhayley, she was kind of funny. She was always asking my husband questions after church. Sometimes they were thoughtful, and sometimes they were just flat out funny. I remember one time we was having a potluck supper that night, and Miss Mayhayley asked my husband, Preacher Lovick, if Jesus came to our supper, what do you think he'd bring? That about got me in stitches that time. Another time she's real serious, and she looked up and said, Preacher Lovick, what do you think Noah thought when he realized he'd left the unicorns behind? Oh my, she was a crazy woman. Now, she was quite the wealthy one, and as you can see her tombstone here, well, this is the third tombstone we've had to put into place for Miss Mayhayley Lancaster. We do take care of it. Now, I can tell you one thing that might surprise you. She was scared of lightning. She'd take off running in the lightning storm from any house she could get to, and sometimes we'd be home and she'd come on in, and she'd set for a spell till that storm passed, and if I had a nice pot roast simmering on the stove, she'd sometimes stay a mite longer. Well, I was with Miss Mayhayley when she drew her last breath. Yes, in those days, as the preacher's wife, it was my job to sit with those who were sick. And when she drew her last breath, she looked at me and said, Neither did his brethren believeth in him. So that's what we put on her stone. Happy 150th birthday, Miss Amanda Mayhayley Lancaster. You are a colorful character who I have so enjoyed researching and telling your tales over the years. If you're interested in more stories about Miss Mayhayley, Georgia Location Scout Tour Company offers a tour called Moonshine, Murder, and Mayhayley, where we delve deeper into her life story. But for now, happy 150th birthday. We hope you enjoyed a little homage to Miss Mayhayley Lancaster.